26 books. That's quite a remarkable achievement. Dick was a powerful force of reform, championing legislation for the public good over the personal interests of Chicago's enduring democratic machine. He was an outspoken critic of business as usual politics that would favor insiders and special interests. During the closing years of the Richard J. Daley regime, and Dick, of course, had the courage to stand on the floor in the city council and to defy Daley, along with a small handful of independents and progressive reformers. But of course, as Dick will likely say, in those days, the mayor had a good way of shutting up his opponents. He would signal up to the upper floor, and the operator of the information switches would just turn off the knob, silencing the microphone of the person who dared to speak against the Daleys. And did that ever happen to you, Dick? Did they ever turn off the microphone? Every meeting. Every meeting. Dick sponsored numerous pieces of significant legislation, including ending salary discrimination against women holding similar jobs as men did. Yes, yeah, you can absolutely give him a hand. He also helped senior citizens and the homeless at a time when there wasn't much attention being paid to the homeless population in Chicago. For 50 years, this man has served the city of Chicago faithfully, seeking its best interests and championing underdogs as they come, and imparting his considerable knowledge and wisdom to the students that he taught in the lecture halls at the U of I. I personally know Dick since I worked in City Hall, and at this time I would like to invite him up and to give this talk about Chicago's mayors going back to on the time of Harold Washington. Dick?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we've got to do. Thank you. Well, I hope to live up to all that Rich has suggested. But in any case, I want to tell you about the last 5 mayors before this one in Chicago. And then I will end with a brief discussion of Brandon Johnson's administration, which isn't in the book. Well, I don't know if you know how long it takes to do books, because you can't keep up with. Brandon Johnson was just elected as to went to press. I'm going to talk about these modern mayors from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. And going back, as Rich was suggesting, to the Richard J. Daley machine first, we have to remember that in those days, what we had was machine politics, which was based on patronage jobs at City Hall and the other local governments. City services delivered to you folks as favors. You vote for the Democratic Party, you got the services, and didn't vote for the Democratic Party, forget it. You're not going to get your sweet shop or a tree trimmed or any of those things. And finally, of course, crooked contracts. I love the Tribune in 1896 wrote a story about crooked with contracts at City Hall. Thievery is written between the lines, which I thought was a good way to express it. But in the modern period, we began to make a transition from the Richard J. Daley machine and Richard J. Daley's government. There have been 2 types of Chicago mayors throughout history, but particularly these last 5. There have been the progressive reform mayors, that most modern, most current that you're familiar with, to start with Harold Washington as a progressive reformer. And then there have been the builder establishment mayors, and they have different goals. They get elected in different ways, and they perform different things, which are good for Chicago, and of course they make mistakes, which are bad for Chicago. But what we trace out is this dialectic between the progressive reform mayors and the builder establishment mayor. Within an overall arc, that is, up until this point, has been an arc of progressive reforms. Now, it may switch back in the next election. It might go to a builder mayor. But at the moment, we have from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot and now even to Brandon Johnson, this direction. So we start with Harold Washington, the first modern progressive reform mayor. He was elected and governed on a reform platform. And, I'm going to try and make this short so there's plenty of time for questions. If you want, I'll detail what his platform was. And the way his proponents and members of the government of that time put it, he raised the floor of government. It's a sort of before Harold Washington, after Harold Washington kind of story. Before Harold Washington, there was no affirmative action at City Hall. Blacks, Latinos, women, gays, all locked up. And they might hold a job as janitor, but they didn't hold the important positions and direct the city. After Harold Washington, there was an affirmative action in cabinet appointments, in city jobs, and in city contracts. That's an immense difference. But Harold did more. He signed the Shackman Decree, which began to end patronage hiring at City Hall. The first action that Harold Washington took right after he was sworn in and went to City Hall is he signed a Freedom of Information executive order. When I was alderman, even aldermen who wanted to know, how the city was spending its money would have to go to the comptroller's office with a yellow pad and a pencil. Citizens couldn't get this information no matter what they did. So freedom of information was really important because now it meant that whatever the government was doing with your tax dollars, there was a way to audit by civic leaders, by aldermen, and by individual citizens. And then he ended his term in office after his re-election. One of the last things he did is he passed the first ethics ordinance in the history of Chicago. We had not had an ethics ordinance in over 150 years before Harold Washington. That's why Harold Washington is so important, the before and the after contrast in so many areas. I'm not going to go into all the details about Harold, but you will remember that he governed during a time of council wars. So this wasn't so easy. There were 29 aldermen, led by Alderman Burke and Berdoliak, who worked to block his program. So for the first 3 years, often he couldn't get his legislation, he couldn't get his appointments through the city council. He won a special election with other aldermanic candidates and gained control after 3 years. And in his re-election, suddenly the council changed. Instead of 29-21, it was 40 for Harold and 10 against. A big difference, but he only lived 7 months. Now, what was Harold's legacy? His greatest legacy, the authors in our book, we have other authors who write each of the chapters, but what they claim is his greatest legacy wasn't just, like the ethics ordinance or a particular thing. His greatest legacy was cultural transformation. He proved that reformers could win and reforms could be enacted once they were elected. And he won with a rainbow coalition of blacks, whites, and Latinos and showed that that was possible. And that's affected us the last 40 years. So in the book, for each mayor, we asked 4 questions, and I'm not going to, in my talk, answer them for all of them. It takes a little too long. I'm happy to in question. We asked, how did they get elected? What kind of coalition? What kind of campaign? How much money did they raise? Second, we asked, what was their relation with the city council? Because that is really a very powerful way to understand a mayoral period. Third, we asked, what crises did they face and how did they deal with them? Think of the COVID crisis or think of the current crisis with migrants. How the mayor faced big crises and whether they overcame them and succeeded or not, how well they dealt with the crisis is very important in understanding that. And last of all, as I mentioned for Harold, what was their legacy? For instance, that Harold changed permanently Chicago's political culture. This kid. So you're probably familiar with Harold Washington. Most of you look to be of an age that you would know who he was. You may have forgotten, though, he was followed by Eugene Sawyer. Eugene Sawyer is sort of a forgotten Chicago mayor. He served 2 years. And what's not really remembered most often about Eugene Sawyer is that he carried out the Harold Washington policies. That is, didn't really have his own agenda. What he did was enact the Harold Washington policies. And that was despite having 15 of the aldermen in the city council deadly against those, and the most chaotic council in all modern Chicago history. For instance, in 1 year, he had 187 divided roll call votes. The aldermen couldn't agree if the sun came up this morning or not. So it was a real struggle, but he did make major contributions like the Human Rights Ordinance, it's sometimes called the Gay Rights Ordinance, and I could go on down specifics of carrying out the Harold Washington agenda. And it was most curious, you remember the chaotic city council meeting when he got elected. One of the longest meetings in Chicago history. It lasted until 4 in the morning. It was chaotic. You may remember Mitchell Mell getting up on his desk in the midst of the chaos, and Sawyer walking off the floor and having to be convinced to stay in the race for mayor, and all of the things that happened. The white alderman knew that after Harold, they'd been told by people like George Johns, if you don't elect a black mayor to succeed Harold, we'll have riots in the street. So they were convinced, they weren't happy about it, and they also couldn't get enough votes for any one of their members to ascend to power. So they said, okay, we'll take Gene Sawyer. He's a nice guy who's been around forever. He works in patronage. He's part of the old machine. It'll be just fine. The amazing thing is, after Sawyer got into office and was carrying out these Harold Washington policies, the very alderman who had gotten him elected voted consistently against it. And the very alderman who had opposed his election, the Tim Evans supporter, voted for him. So you have a very weird kind of period, sort of an interim between the Harold Washington period and the future period. Now, of course, now as I move forward in history, you're more familiar probably with Richard M. Daley, who the most unusual thing about Richard M. Daley is he's disappeared in a way. He was the most powerful person, at the height of his of his mayoralty. He was in front cover of Time magazine. He was one of the great mayors of America, and then suddenly afterwards he disappears. He's still alive, but somehow we've lost track of what he did. But let me talk about, so Daley is a good example, Richard M., of a builder mayor, a builder establishment. Talk a little bit about that, but what we end up in the book crediting Richard M. Daley is building this, what was our authors call the city of spectacle. The entire lakefront is redone. Millennium Park, Navy Pier is done. They redo McCormick Place a couple of times. There were fences around the schools and the parks, flowers in the parkway. Daley also, as I usually is remembered, also built anchor institutions, particularly libraries and schools, into the neighborhoods. So Daley is building Chicago, just like his father, Richard Day, had rebuilt the city in the midst of a decline, the deindustrialization that had been occurring after World War II, when Richard J. Daley came into power. So Richard M. is sort of following that, but he's very different from his father because he is presiding as Chicago becomes a global city. He also differs from his father. He's sometimes credited with building a new machine, but he won elections in a different way. So Richard M. Daley raised campaign money from the individuals and businesses in the global economy, and he raised $7 million. Well, Richard J. Daley never raised $1 million for any of his campaigns. So we're talking about 7 times the money between the father and the son. Now, why did he need $7 million? Well, I don't have time to go into why he lost in 1983, but he had a pretty poorly ran campaign, and it was sort of amateur night in a way. He raised $7 million to run a presidential-style campaign with political consultants, some names you know, like David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel. These were all on the staff of that campaign, and they ran a brilliant campaign in 1989. However, Richard M. Daley won with 89% of the white vote, but only 7% of the black vote. We got the other votes he needed from the Latino community. Now, by the time Richard M. Daley became mayor, the Shachtman lawsuits, which I will be glad to play in question period, but the suit by Shachtman had began to eliminate patronage hiring at City Hall. So from the Shachtman lawsuit, we know that the testimony in the court hearings were that there were 35,000 patronage employees at, not just the city, but the county, the school, and so on. And by Richard M. Daley's period, there's another lawsuit, a storage case, and the number of tout positions on the tout list was 5,000. And you've had a continual decline after that. In addition, Daley didn't trust the ward committeeman because after his father's death, the ward committeeman and the state legislature turned against him. Hey, we're going to get rid of the son. We're going to get one of us to move forward. So what he did was build his own patronage army. They called themselves the Daley Volunteers. I worked with some of them in a couple of campaigns. They weren't ward-based. They would move anywhere in the city. The mayor said, let's, elect this congressman or let's elect this person. And they would go work there. They were molded. That's a very different from the Richard J. Daley period. If you want, I can, again, go into more details of the difference. But in the book, we're highlighting what's the patterns that are evolving. How is Chicago changing from mayor to mayor? I'm rushing ahead to Rahm Emanuel. Richard M. Daley reigned or was mayor for 22 years, the longest serving mayor in Chicago history. Rahm Emanuel comes along, and Rahm Emanuel, it's a little like Sawyer following Washington, but Emanuel did better than Sawyer did. But Emanuel's also a build-a mayor. And it's as if he put the Richard M. Daley operation on steroids. Instead of $7 million, he's now raising $32 million for his campaign. But the downside of the Rahm Emanuel period, I'm really condensing here, was he was known as Mayor 1%. He was thought he was ruling for the rich or the people who live Lakeshore Drive or whatever, and not for the other folk, particularly not for the poor. He closed 6 mental health clinics. He closed 50 public schools. And there were other things like that got him the label. Whether the label's totally justified or not, we can, again, discuss. There were other things that weren't really as recognized by the average citizen. Rahm Emanuel had the most rubber-stamped city council of any in the history of Chicago. In other words, he said, we're going to do A, they did A. We're not going to do B, they don't do B. He had a more rubber-stamped city council than either Richard J. or Richard S. The book is sort of chock full of those kinds of pieces of information that hadn't been fully digested. But again, I go forward. Lori Lightfoot. So Lori Lightfoot was elected and governed, in some ways like Carol Washington, by a coalition of two overlapping groups. The good government reformers, think of Lakefront liberals, League of Women Voters, Better Government Association, those times she used to be on the board of BGAs. Those kinds of folks who want good, clean government, services at the cheapest possible cost to the taxpayer. And the progressives or the social reformers. And so she was elected in part as the reformer because of Alderman Ed Burke and Tony Preckwinkle's scandal that broke with the indictment of Ed Burke. And what that was Ed Burke had been getting business people and others to get his law firm to represent them on tax cases and to give $10,000 to the Tony Preckwinkle re-election campaign. So if there'd just been the Ed Burke scandal with a standalone, that wouldn't have caused the problem for Tony Preckwinkle, but Tony Preckwinkle was directly linked in, and Tony Preckwinkle was the strongest other candidate running for mayor. But let's go back to Labor Day and the year that we're coming up, that we're going to the election. Rahm Emanuel has raised a lot of money. He has a campaign organization he's running, and he drops out, presumably because he figured out he couldn't win. He had, at the time, 31% of the electorate supporting him, according to the poll. And the other candidates had only 16%. But 31% isn't 50%, and he knew that we're going to be facing some major challenges in the next 4 years. For whatever personal reasons or the rest, he drops out on Labor Day. Now, the other candidates I mentioned had 16, for the higher candidates, who were a bunch of them money, had 16% support. Lightfoot had only 3%. So how does Lori Lightfoot go from 3% to winning the election? Well, there was two frames of reference. In campaigns, the thing you want to do is set up what's the fight about, and you want to set it up in a way that you will win the argument. So those candidates like Mendoza and Preckwinkle, too many other candidates for me to list and you to keep track of, but we'll take them as examples. Mendoza and Preckwinkle argued they should be elected because they had experience in government, and this person, Lightfoot, didn't have any experience in government. I mean, she'd held positions in the library, and she'd held other positions in city government, and was a lawyer and as a former assistant U.S. attorney. But she had not been in an executive position like we county board presidents or we state officials. Lightfoot, on the other hand, framed the situation as reforms were needed. And she did this before any news scandals. And essentially what happened is the majority of voters, particularly after the scandals, decided and opted for Lightfoot's definition. That is, this is a race about who can reform and take care of the problems we're seeing in our government. Even still, Lightfoot was at a disadvantage. The other candidates had more money. Bill Daley, following sort of after Richard M., had $9 million. Preckwinkle had $5 million. And even by the time the runoff election was over, Lightfoot had only $1.5 million. So it's a 9-to-1 in favor of people like Bill Daley being able to win. But in an election, you don't have to have the most money. What you have to have is enough money to get your message to the voters by TV ad, direct mail, precinct workers if you have them, and so forth. She got 2 breaks. She was endorsed by the Chicago Sun-Times, which was the first. So you've got a major newspaper saying, yes, we should elect Lightfoot over Preckwinkle and all the other candidates. And then secondly, she was able to put up TV ads, and the TV ads were very clever. What she did is portray Preckwinkle, Mendoza, Chico, and Daley, the 4 top candidates at that point, as being hooked to the clique of corrupt politicians. Say that fast. So she was able to tie them in the public image to corruption. Not personally, and she wasn't accusing so-and-so of taking money from the till, but that they're part of this corrupt political establishment. I'm the reformer, and therefore Lightfoot was able to win. Now, she led the field in the primary with only 17.5% of the vote. It's not like she had landslide at that time. Well, she went on to win the general election, which y'all may remember, with 74% of the vote and carried all 50 wards. Rahm Emanuel, her immediate predecessor, had a rubber stamp city council. But under Lightfoot, she wasn't just elected herself. 12 new aldermen were elected for that city council. And the council was no longer and is not today, is no longer a rubber stamp. It split into 4 factions. There was a central liberal bloc, mostly of committee chairs and lakefront liberals. That's one block. and it's pretty big. There are 18 committee chairs at that time. The Progressive Caucus and Democratic Socialists, which had grown in that same election, the number of them. And then there were the machine aldermen that were left. There were about 5 of those. And finally, there was a conservative bloc that you may be familiar with of Northwest Side aldermen who were essentially, I'm not saying it's negatively, closet Republicans, that they were very conservative. So you had 4 different factions. You didn't have a simple rubber stamp city council like you had had under either Daley or under Manuel. Now, as mentioned, that it's important to think about the challenges and crises. Mayor Lightfoot encountered the biggest challenge and crisis was the COVID-19 crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. And generally, she handled them well. Better than, for instance, Mayor Johnson's handling of the asylum seeker migrant crisis. If you think of crises in both administrations, how well did they handle them? Lightfoot had, with her excellent health commissioner and cooperating with the state and the national government once Biden got elected, she was able to say, this is what the plan is, you're going to do this. You have a funny commercial on the lakefront standing behind the police barricade saying, stop, you have to wear a mask. She was seen as handling this crisis very well. Some of the other things that were key in her administration was like the Invest Southwest program. She's talking about reinvesting in the poorest communities of Chicago. We're not talking about $1.95. We're talking about tens and hundreds of millions of dollars spread out in the poorest neighborhoods so that Harold Washington had the notion of balanced economic development, which actually Richard M. Daley continued. The notion is you not only build up the loop, but you build up the neighborhoods. And she did it in her particular case with the Invest Southwest. Now, she was lucky, in comparison to Harold Washington, in that she had a working majority in the city council. She could get the blocks to join with her on different combinations on all the legislation. She didn't lose any votes. She, in general, more of her good government reforms, however, than her progressive reform. The first thing she did when she was in office, because I helped draft it, was an ethics executive order. And among it was doing away with aldermanic privilege on lots of services and fees and things that aldermen had been interfering on. But there were other things like that. She wasn't successful with her progressive goals. She had started things like Invest Southwest, but all the construction and the rest hadn't finished. You couldn't see, oh, this Eaglewood is now revitalized because the city put in these projects. That's happening now, and then when it all happens, we'll be grateful for it. Still, the overall argument of the book is that both Washington and Lightfoot were part of an arc of reform from 1983 to the present. But builder mayors were also important for what they've contributed to Chicago. So what do we learn from the study of these 5 mayors? And I'll end with this. We've oscillated back and forth between establishment building mayors like Daley and Emanuel and progressive reform mayors like Washington and Lightfoot. And that's a trend that's still continuing. We've moved from a manufacturing to a service to a global economy in the same time. There's been a big transformation. We're not where we were in the 1970s with the decline of Chicago and loss of manufacturing and so forth. At the same time, that switch to the global economy has not brought all wonderful and light to us. There is a racial and economic inequality, and perhaps even more frightening, a widening income gap. We have a wider income gap than most of the country, and we have a wider income gap than we had, say, under Richard J. Daley or whichever mayor you want to choose. In the meantime, the city council has been transformed from a rubber stamp into something resembling a more genuine legislative body. Aldermen actually author legislation and pass it on their own, not under the mayor's signature. So by documenting the last 40 years, we can learn from the past and choose a more positive future, because the struggle for the future of Chicago is not over. It's still continuing. Now, as I mentioned, the book was sent to the publisher and published before Mayor Johnson. But if we take the four same questions we asked of the other mayor, I'll just give a quick thumbnail sketch. So Brandon Johnson was elected by a broad-based progressive coalition and the support of the teachers' unions. Lightfoot lost not on policies, her policies, Brandon Johnson's policies are pretty close. Yes, Johnson is a little more extreme or a little more left, but the difference is very hard to parse. She lost because she was seen as too combative. She had a negative public image and persona. Paul Vallis was seen as too conservative, as exemplified by the endorsement by the police union. Second, Johnson has controlled the city council, just like Lightfoot has, and he's not lost a single vote. All but two votes that are very peculiar votes ended up within, that are divided. He ended up winning about 30 to 12, but 30 to 20 at the worst. So he has the working majority he needs to govern. His biggest crisis, as everyone recognizes, has been the migrant crisis and also the crime issue. But there's also been, he talked about a progressive agenda, but he's not been able to implement it completely because he hasn't been able to raise the $800 million in taxes that he said in the campaign he would need to implement the agenda. His answer is, well, I've made a down payment. I can't reopen 6 mental health clinics this year, but I'll reopen 2 and so forth. And we don't know what his legacy will be. It's too soon to tell and too early in the first chunk. So I'll be glad to take your questions about any of the mayors and respond to what you want to know. So we'll start over here. We've got a mic here. Well, I think he's recording it because there's it's a hybrid meeting. Well, Blagojevich never got he would like to have been mayor, but he never made it. We started the book with, yes, we did not do Richard J. Daley, we didn't do Byrne, we didn't do Bilandic, we didn't do Kelly, we didn't do Edward Dunn back at the start of the century. The book itself is divided simply into the 5 last mayors on purpose, because if we were going to do, but first of all, if you're interested in those mayors, there's an excellent set of books by Holly and Green to cover those mayors. So we were updating that discussion about the modern mayor. Yes, sir. Man with the mic.
Can you help me remember the other person who was mayor in that same period and was brought down by a Parks Land scandal? He was mayor for about a day and a half.
Oh, David Orr, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, David Orr was mayor for a day and a half. Well, actually, it was a little longer, but not much. He was mayor until the city council could elect the final successor back in the Sawyer period. And so he wasn't able to implement any programs. He didn't, the term was just too brief. He was a reformer. He would have been a good mayor, but he couldn't get the votes in the city council to become mayor.
How was he chosen?
Well, after Richard J. Daley, when he died, we knew we had the city. I was in the city council. We were going to vote for who the next mayor would be. But there was no procedure. We had no real president pro tem. You may remember that Wilson Foss tried to use the title to become mayor. That didn't work. I won't go into all of the fights that occurred. I was part of the discussions, both the caucuses and the floor fight. And so we said, well, we need to be able to have a succession system. And so we chose Bilandic, and I have in other of my books the details of how that happened. In any case, fast forward, and when Washington dies, we do have a system, and David Orr was the deputy mayor and automatically became mayor until the city council could elect a mayor. So that's why David had such a short period.
So, Dick, since I have the microphone,
Yeah.
my question is, excuse me, how would you contrast the ability to get elected from the ability to be effective as an administrator?
Well, ideally, they would be able to do both. That's what you're hoping when you cast your vote for whoever the candidate is not that they'll win, but that they will govern in an effective way in the direction you think the city or the nation should go. But they are different skills. You could have some excellent campaigners. I will drop back. For instance, Jane Byrne was a fabulous campaigner. She was very good in the one-to-one contacts, the ads that Don Rose made for her standing in the snow during the great snowstorm was enough to overcome the landing. But for a number of reasons, her reign was not very good. First of all, of course, we wrote the transition team report and she threw it in the wastebasket. She refused to read it because of jealousy of the head of the transition team. She had a revolving door at city council and city government, so I think there were 4 or 5 budget directors, 4 or 5 of, all the key appointments. She angered the African American community in ways she wouldn't have had to do. She was making appointments of conservative whites to boards like CHA. Well, aren't many, other than seniors, there aren't many whites who were in public housing. It's primarily African American community, so they ought to be in the majority of the boards, and so forth. I mean, she did things in a sort of whirlwind way. Not to say she didn't do anything, but, you're asking about what's the difference between electability, which is the ability to convince people to vote for you, or just being there at the right time can get you elected. Like Lightfoot wouldn't have gotten elected without the Burt Kreckwinkle scandal breaking. So it's not all wonderful charisma or whatever, but they are very different skills. A good politician should have both sets of skills. They ought to be able to convince the public that they have a clear program that the public will agree to and that are capable of governing, and then they need to have the skills to govern.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Looks like there are a few. He's coming next.
Based on the challenges going forward that you've sort of touched on here, what's in your crystal ball for the next 4 or 5 years for the city?
Well, first of all, in terms of Brandon Johnson has gotten off to a very slow start. The transition team for Johnson, which produced an excellent report, came 2 months after he was elected, whereas, for instance, when I was on the Lightfoot transition team, we had the transition team report before she was elected, and she could carry out some of the things starting on the first day. Secondly, Brandon Johnson, even this week, appointed the head of cultural affairs, so he's still building her cabinet. Well, you don't normally wait a year to build your cabinet. I mean, he's been putting people into position. Most of his appointments have been good, but they're slow. So it's, as you know, we lost the referendum on Bring Chicago Home just yesterday. Johnson doesn't have the $800 million to carry out all of the progressive reforms that he'd hoped to do. So it's, I think, too early to say for sure how it's going to work out. If you're asking about other things about Chicago and its transition, I think we have to overcome this widening income gap and also the historic racial discrimination, which is part of it. But the income gap goes beyond the race. It's a lot of people, white, black, Latino, so forth, Asian American, are not earning a livable wage, and not earning enough to move to the middle class. I'll give you just one quick statistic, and I'm not remembering the year quite now, but let's say 6 years ago, maybe it was the 2000 census, 42% of all the census tracts in the city of Chicago were middle class. In the last census, 16% of middle class. We have wiped out much of the middle class. Well, paraphrase Lincoln, you can't long succeed with a situation where they're half rich and half poor. He was using the term half free and half slave, but that's just not a tenable situation. So that's a terribly difficult problem to solve. But that's one example. We're also, as you know, going through a transition. We don't quite know post-COVID, how do we deal with office vacancy? Because people are working from home. There are a lot of social, economic transitions going on that are not not caused by the politicians, but are caused by social and economic forces. And their job is to be able to ameliorate the negative consequences of those and to accentuate the positive thing. So take the next question, and there was a question up front.
Yeah. I worked on the Vallis campaign, and after the primary, it was just like, oh, hey, we won so well that the general election is just a technicality, and your next mayor is going to be Vallis. And well, he ended up losing, and I have to wonder what happened. Did the election get stolen, or did
No.
the voters, did the Vallis voters just get complacent and not turn out? That's my
Mostly
question.
that. In addition, the swing vote was really sort of the lakefront ward. You had a number of people who were going to support Vallis. You had a number of people who were going to support Johnson with teachers union and so forth. But the lakefront had decided not to continue with Lightfoot. That's really why she lost. And the RAF wanted to make a decision collectively, but they did. And so in the last stage, when they were doing the runoff, they had to decide about this tough on crime, more conservative approach versus Brandon Johnson. And Brandon Johnson they weren't wildly enthusiastic about Brandon Johnson. They hadn't voted for him in the primary, but when faced with a choice, the way it was presented to them, they chose to go with Johnson. And so the votes that Vallis came close in a close election, but you remember what I said about framing the election under Lightfoot, how it was framed between the executive, I've been an executive, I can run your government, I'll be fine, and we need reform. So you use a different shading of that in the Vallis-Johnson campaign, but it was the same kind of thing. Vallis lost because he lost the frame. But if he wasn't, if he's saying, I've been doing all these wonderful things with CPS and so forth and so on, these were the good old days. Richard M. Daley had appointed me. I was key to the Daley cabinet and so on. That would have been a different fight. It was partly the mistake of the Vallis campaign staff, and it was partly just the way it unrolled. I can't tell you, I don't have a perfect answer, but it's in that kind of way of thinking about it.
Thank you.
Karen, you had a question, and then... and Dave.
Okay, I just have maybe a point of information. When Emmanuel closed the schools in the 90s, it was Paul Vallis, the head of the board, and the teachers union held him responsible. So when he became a candidate, it was like gasoline to the CTU.
It was,
CTU. They came out in mass to bury Paul Vallis.
Yep. Got a bunch of questions. We can only get one at a time. You have to be patient here.
That's and the word advice. I've started all
Hi there.
two questions. One question. I'm fascinated by the arc of the mayors, and you said there's two basic styles. There's the
Yes.
with one and the builders,
Yes.
and they're alternating back and forth.
Yes.
Which can you speak about how that's helpful for?
Well, let's take the example. So I've told you about Harold Washington before Harold and after Harold. Let's take Richard M. Daley as a building mayor. At the time he came into office, there was, you still had essentially racial wars going on at City Hall. Everybody was shouting at each other in the city council chambers. It was still a really racially divided city, and he calmed down the waters. I think was a phrase he used. He was able to mute the racial aspect, even though he didn't get many black votes. He got more the longer he stayed in office. He got more black votes each election. But the building up, you know, key to Chicago's economy is convention and tourism. So if you think about things like Millennium Park, I won't take all of them, I'll just take that as an example, or the museum campus, which is totally redone under Richard M. Daley. That's a major advance for Chicago. I can't tell you, I'll make up the number, but because it's in the book, I think. But let's say there are 40 million visitors a year to Chicago, spending their money. Every time they spend a dime, we get extra hotel tax. Every time they buy a candy bar, we get sales tax. A lot of the money for Chicago comes from convention and tourism. In addition, if you have these conventioneers coming here, they begin to say to themselves, maybe I should put my company in Chicago. This is a beautiful place, and I wouldn't mind living, or up in the suburbs or wherever, but I'll bring my business here because it's such a neat place to be, as opposed to wherever the company is headquartered now or where the executives are. So that's just an example of what builder mayors do. The downside, you can see it particularly with Rahm Emanuel, is this mayor 1%. Is this good for everybody, or is this just good for those that are doing well in Chicago, the already rich? So that's a short version.
That's the alternate.
So the alternating goes back and forth. We have a great leap forward. You take someone like Carol Washington, who's doing all of the, let's call them radical reforms, affirmative action and so forth, ethics ordinance. Well, after that, but other things aren't getting done for them because of council wars or whatever, you get a builder mayor to come in and they're building up the city in another way, but they aren't solving the social problems. So you need this sort of back and forth to be able to get a solid movement forward, even though it's not all builder mayor. You don't want all builder mayors overdoing, say, building the loop up, or reform mayors. It'd be nice to have good government reform mayors, but progressive mayors spending a lot of money on social programs. So you kind of balance back and forth. Now, does anybody make a plan like this? No, this is just the way it's been. Is it going to continue that way? We don't know. I would not be surprised to see a builder mayor come after Johnson. That's quite possible because we may have exhausted, what we can do in the progressive effort and need to consolidate as we would do under a builder mayor. I don't know, you've got the mic.
Yeah. Hi. In regards to the Chicago Teachers Union, do you think that its power has changed the dynamics of Chicago politics?
I think it has, but they're not the only force that's been involved. The teachers union is not responsible for electing all those new. Well, they did some campaigns for particular aldermen and candidates and give some particular candidates money. But if you look, I wouldn't credit the teachers union with winning Maria Haddon in the 49th ward, or I'll go down the list. So a lot of them are getting elected over local issues that are in their community. There are other unions besides the teachers union. SEIU is one of them. And there are other forces. There are also other problems we're confronting. So, if we define the problem as corruption, then we're going to elect one kind of mayor. If we define the problem as we need to build up the loop, you're going to get a different kind of mayor. Yes, sir. Okay. Another historian, or a historian. I'm not even a historian. I'm a political
How
scientist.
about a political observer? Anyway, I've often made the statement that there simply is not enough money in Chicago to cure all the ills and maintain the city on a functional basis anything. And we have Richard M. Daley taking the parking meter issue and selling it or leasing it out for 1.5, I think it was, $1 billion, which is a considerable amount of money. But within 10 or 15, for a long-term lease.
Yeah, the lease is 99 years, and you got 5 years before
Right,
with it.
and it was
Used up
paid
the money.
back. So the backers of this issue are receiving money from the residents and so forth using parking meters. Well, if we continue to dispose of our revenue-generating assets, of which I can't think of too many except Midway Airport, no air airport left, that we will have no recourse except to go back to the taxpayers, and the taxpayers at Pleasant Frank, in my observation, are basically tapped out. And we see on the news and so forth that the convention business, we're losing from the convention business. They're moving their shows.
Well, it's coming back, but it's not as high as it was,
Right,
say,
and that's a great
10 years ago.
dependence. Yeah, great dependence. So, on the part of the city. So, what do you see for the future of us, taxpayers, dealing with resolving the problems with on a monetary basis?
Well, it's a very simple to say solution. It's very difficult to do. The simple truth is if we build up the economy, then we've got something to tax. So if you bring in another 20 corporations and they have each 500 employees, whatever they be, and all of those have lunch downtown or whatever, we get more money that we don't have now. So the easy answer always is build the economy. Now, when you get down to the question of how do you build the economy, that's one set of problems. The other problem is here's what you suggest, which is government has to make wise decisions about spending the money, and there have been some unwise decisions in the past. The most notable is the failure, particularly at the state government level, but it also happened at the city, to pay in at the time into the pension plan. So a lot of the money that could be used for services is having to go to pension. Now, I'm a pensioner under the state. I'm teaching at the university, and I don't want you to cut my pension, but the basic idea isn't, whether you cut the pension. The pensioners have all paid in what they were supposed to pay. But the city and the state took a shortcut, just like they did with the parking meters, and decided, oh, well, we will, put in the right amount this year. We'll only put in half of it. And this went on for a decade under several mayors and several governors. And it's in the worst part of the bind we face now. But the simple solution is grow the economy. So you figure out how to do that, and I'll figure out how to spend the money you make.
Kidding.
If I may,
Professor, you give me a chair because, I'm an old man. I'm going to sit down for a while. Turn it around back here if you want. Yes, go ahead.
if I may, Professor Simpson, what factor, perhaps if at all, was Mayor Lightfoot's handling of the summer of 2020 and the riots that occurred in Chicago versus going back in ancient history, Richard J. Daley in the summer of '68? Maybe that's too far a stretch chronologically.
Well, let's just go with the Lightfoot one because I will know all about the '68 convention. We've got an expert on conventions here. But if we take the Lightfoot thing, yes, the crime problem, particularly the spree on the north side, the increase of certain kind of crimes. The interesting thing is the murder rate has actually gone back down. So have some other major crime indicated, which you wouldn't know. I mean, it still doesn't matter if your car got jacked or you had a burglary. You don't care what the statistics say. So the crime problem is still too great. But yes, that was a big part of the reason Lightfoot didn't get reelected.
I walked down State Street about a week ago. I was at the south end of State Street by Harold Washington Library, and I'm walking north, and one boarded up store after another. In fact, from what I could see, there were maybe only 2 or 3 stores that were even open. We've lost State Street, obviously, and we might even lose Michigan Avenue with the smash and grab kind of issues that have been happening. And if we lose our retail, what are we going to have left? Because now we have to figure out that Believe itself is going to convert into a residential community with the loss of all the office jobs and the vacancies in the office market. And at least to my way of thinking, if the center falls away, so does everything else. And the economy of downtown, I think it's critical. And I don't see this mayor really paying much attention to the bills issue that I think is so crucial.
So, one ray of hope. First of all, our downtown has been the fastest growing downtown in the country. We've had a lot of young people and seniors move in. There are a lot of new condominiums and rental apartments, and that's really revived. I mean, it used to be if you went in the old days, I mean, there were stores during the day, but it come 5 o'clock, the place closed down, and you could shot a cannon down State Street and not hit anybody. So we did make a good comeback. I think the LaSalle Street project that they're talking about, which will have commercial on the bottom and have a mix of office and then a mix of housing on the top, is a good solution for the immediate kind, because that gives you customers. So now I want to open my store, whether it's a Walgreens or whatever it is, because I've got customers downtown. And we need to do all of it. Yes, we need to get crime under control. Yes, we need to be, the merchants, the retail itself is changing so much with Amazon and the rest of it. We're in the middle of a major transformation of how we live, how we shop, how we work. All of that's happening at the same time. Our job is to then somehow take advantage of the good trends and lessen the bad trends.
They also the what's the
Sure. I'm glad there's so many questions. We don't have to go all night, though. Yes, ma'am.
Back in November, I and a cousin were downtown, and we're right at the corner of Madison and State Street. It was packed, just packed. And all you hear repeatedly is, nobody's there, nobody's there. I don't want to go downtown. I don't want to take the Blue Line. I don't want to take Metro. Nobody is nobody. But that's not true. And I think the newspapers need to write it up much, much better than they do. And they don't. All you hear is the negative. And that's what I suppose sells. But
Well, there's some good trends going on. They're not great trends, but they're good. And that is that since COVID, the CTA has come back substantially. They've got like 54% ridership now. That's not 100%. It's a long way, but they were starting at a very low point. They're working on new programs to deal with crime on the CTA and so forth. Is it enough? No, but I'm one of the kind of people, the glass is half full, and I see a way to a positive future. Whether we get there or not, it's a whole different problem.
even on Michigan Avenue,
Yeah.
I love it. And you can walk and walk and walk. And there are people, there are a lot of people down there. And that's what I think the public needs to know.
Yeah. There was, how many more questions do we want to do? Looking back.